are not an end in themselves. No matter how sophisticated they are, no matter how they are being used in other countries, digital technologies are only means to achieve goals. As such, they should be adapted to the realities of Africa and not the other way around. In Addis Ababa, you will find grocery stores with the most advanced payment terminals from Ethiopian banks. But they are barely used because Ethiopians use cash for payment. There are plenty of examples of digital initiatives that missed the understanding and missed the view and missed the point, as they are just disconnected from the African reality. However, there are also brilliant examples of successful digital initiatives that have a huge impact on the African people, such as mobile money, which is being used today for financial services, money transfer, and you can even have saving accounts through mobile money. This is a compelling demonstration of what Africa can do by itself with digital technologies to address its own specific needs. Indeed, specific factors distinguish Africa from other continents, and each of them determines our African approach to digitalization. One of the most important factors is mobile connectivity. Sub-Saharan Africa has led the world in mobile take-up growth in the past few years. In Africa today, about 75% of the population has a SIM card, and 1/3 of them are using smartphone. So there's no doubt that mobile connectivity is one of the main drivers of digital transformation in Africa. The digital transformation also largely depends on our capacity to achieve three fundamental goals that are closely interrelated: the universalization of digital ID, ICT harmonization, and more affordable communications across the continent. There is no way around it. We cannot envision a sustainable digital economy without proper identity. In many countries in Africa, most of our population, they don't even have basic identity. If we don't create the necessary environment to properly identify our population, if we don't invest in infrastructures to develop digital identity, we are not creating an inclusive digital nation. Instead, we are rather promoting an exclusive digital hub that will just increase inequalities and widen the digital divide. As President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, recently said during the last African Union Summit, our commitment must take full advantage of digital revolution. Achieving an harmonized digital ID framework will put Africa at the forefront of the digital economy. But how can we promote the building of digital identities as a cornerstone of our digital nations when so many Africans cannot afford to participate in this digital ecosystem? The Alliance for Affordable Internet defines as being affordable when 1 gigabyte of internet costs no more than 2% than the average income. Africa falls short as 1 gigabyte costs 8% of average income across the continent. This really affects citizens' capacity to fully participate into the digital ecosystem. The very title of this panel provides some interesting answer to these challenges: policy harmonization as a tool for bridging the digital gap in Africa. Such policy harmonization at a regional level has been advocated by Pan-African organizations such as African Union and Smart Africa Alliance. The Transform Africa Summit gives us a platform to continue discussing and promote this concept which is of vital importance for the digital transformation of Africa. I am honored to seize this opportunity to discuss with you, fellow panelists, and I look forward to gathering your views on and ideas about the subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claude. Will I urge you, please come and have a seat, because I know you're going to be part of the panel quite shortly. I'd like to call on the Honorable Minister for Policy Coordination for Japan, Minister Katsuya Watanabe, to give a short remarks. Thank you very much. Please give me a round of applause. It's not easy to come off the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Katsuya Watanabe, MRC of Japan. It is a great honor to be given the opportunity to talk at the Transform Africa Summit here in Kigali. I have been given to understand that the summit meeting this time under the theme of boosting Africa's digital economy is an opportunity to reinforce the digital economy initiatives of every African country. We believe that digitalization will help improve the quality of all people's lives in Africa, create economic growth through innovation, and achieve sustainable and inclusive development. In order to realize inclusive growth in Africa with digital technology and achieve the SDGs by 2030, we consider that multifaceted and unprecedented efforts. In order to realize inclusive growth in Africa with digital technology and achieve the SDGs by 2030, we consider that multifaceted and unprecedented efforts are necessary, which will require not only an expansion of digital infrastructure, but also the improvement of digital skills and the development of digital platforms that can utilize the infrastructure. In Africa, the digitalization of economy and society is progressing, but there are issues such as the widened gap between those who can and cannot gain access to digital society and the development of infrastructure related to ICT. In addition, issues including a lack of basic infrastructure, problems in poverty, medical care and education, and the increasing demand for food and water still exist. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication Japan is promoting efforts to contribute to SDGs through digitalization. For example, we are selecting 10 target areas and are considering the implementation of pilot project initiatives. And we are also working on promoting human resource development and workshops through international organizations. Japan would like to contribute to the sustainable development of the world by sharing with you the know-how of problem resolution, which we will be able to obtain in the process of these initiatives. Next, I'd like to state my ideas and the trends of Japan's efforts related to bridging the digital gap, which is the main subject of this session. ICT is an essential foundation for people's lives, as it contributes to revitalization of economic activities, such as creation of new businesses and improvement of productivity. And it also contributes to solve social issues such as a safe and secure society and social programs in each field, such as medical care, education, and administration. Its role is extremely important for bridging the digital divide to enable a digital society which features such as digital health and digital education for every citizen in the world. It is necessary to install a digital network infrastructure with a certain speed and it achieve high-quality applications with optimal use of digital technology. The development of ICT infrastructure in Japan is based on developed by private telecommunication carriers under the competition policy, but in geographically disadvantaged areas, the development is carried out with public assistance. As a result, the household coverage of ultra-high-speed broadband with a transmission rate of 30 megabps or more is almost 100% for both fixed and mobile. Of course, Japan's experience may or may not apply to all countries. The fastest way to bridge the digital divide is to find the best practice suitable for your country through various elements such as geographical situation, population, distribution, business conditions, and so on. Furthermore, I acknowledge that the role that ICT and the digital economy play in the postal sector has expanded. By developing ICT infrastructure in each country in Africa, we believe that the postal network in each country will be improved, leading to the advance of postal services and the development of e-commerce, as well as the creation of new businesses and the solution of social issues. We believe that efforts to improve ICT infrastructure and enhance postal services in this way make it possible to significantly change people's lives. Japan would like to contribute to UPU's further activities so that ICT and the postal network, which are basic socio-economic infrastructure, can exhibit synergy efforts in Africa as well. Next, I would like to state views in terms of regulation. By incorporating new technologies such as IoT, big data, and AI in all industries and socio-economic activities, new values or services will be created one after another. As a result, we can achieve a human-centered society in which everyone can enjoy a high quality of life while resolving various and social issues. When we introduce revolutionary technologies successfully to society, it is important to develop an environment where a wide variety of stakeholders can participate. It is also crucial to establish guidelines to make them put into practice while minimizing limitations. In addition, we should harmonize an international framework of regulations toward cross-border services. I believe those approaches attract investment from outside Africa countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that international cooperation is important for bridging digital divide, and we will deepen cooperation and collaboration with Smart Africa, including the realization of SDGs. In particular, we assist initiatives including the One Africa Network, Smart Africa Digital ID, and inter-country connectivity in cooperation with Smart Africa, which aims to realize a single African digital market. And also, we will co-organize a high-level roundtable with Smart Africa, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, and Kobe City at the 7th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, TICAD 7, which will be held in Yokohama, Japan in August this year. The conference will issue a joint statement that incorporates a course of action to promote various efforts to promote the relationship between Japan and the member state of Smarter Africa. This time, a total of 18 organizations, including companies and universities with high reliability and high technology, are participating from Japan and exhibiting high-quality IC infrastructure and services of Japan. We look forward to your visit to the Japan Pavilion. Last but not least, while I hope that the Transform Africa Summit will raise the promotion of digital economy in each African country, Japan wishes to continue working on solving various issues in Africa by utilizing ICT. Thank you very much for listening so attentively.
Thank you very much, Minister Watanabe, and it's very good to hear that Japan is willing to share its good practices in order to fast-track the digital economy of Africa. So I would quickly call on my panelists. We have a very arduous task because our session has been shortened, but we still want to have a very engaging session. So I would quickly call on Amrote Abdella. Amrote is the Regional Director of Microsoft for Africa. Amrote, please join us on the panel. We have Serene Diop. Serene is the head of FinTech for MTN. He's representing Eben, who was unable to make it. And then we have Sim Sikut. Sim is the CIO of the government of Estonia. I was telling him Estonia is a poster child of e-policy around the world, so it would be great to hear the experiences as well. So well, a round of applause for our panel. They have a very big task ahead of them. So I'll just go straight to the point. We've heard some of the challenges that you spoke about, Africa's, the high affordability costs in Africa. Some of the other challenges that we discussed earlier when we were in the briefing room, regulation, taxation, the cost of devices. We also talked about adoption, some of the adoption challenges. So we'll delve straight into the policy aspects of this discussion. And I'd like to ask you, what one policy is working well in your area of business? GVG, Claude, tell us a bit more about. And I would replicate the question across.
Thank you for the question. Before answering, I would like to go back to the title of the panel about policy harmonization to bridge the digital divide. I think we need to look at the definition of what is the digital divide, because the typical definition is who does versus who does not have access to ICT. So now let's make sure that we create environments so everyone can have access to ICT. I think this definition should be putting into a broader context, because ICT is not an end, but means to achieve goals, to achieve socio-economic empowerment, and also to achieve social inclusion. Because what's the point of giving the most sophisticated phone or iPad to someone in a village and with internet access if he doesn't know how to read? So how we can put the fastest internet access in a remote village where the young entrepreneurs, they don't know how to create digital businesses. So I think while we are looking at making sure that everyone can have access to ICT, so we need also to look at it in a broader context where we make sure they have the right skills to use them. We invest in literacy. we invest in education, so we create the necessary skills so those tools can really change the communities and make a real difference. Because if we don't do it that way, all we just do is extend the reach of big internet companies so they can reach our population, which will not be an active participant in the digital economy because they will be just on the receiving end. So if I go back now to your question in terms of policy, what policy that I was seeing working elsewhere, I think the policies that integrate together regions that are being looked at regional level really can make a difference. Europe, if one single country decided we need to make a change and update our data protection with GDPR, it would have been more difficult. But 28 countries decided, now let's come together and then we make sure that the data in Europe of the citizens in Europe are protected. So this is an example that Africa can follow, and I believe Smart Africa Alliance is on the right track to bring together different regulators so they can solve problems at the regional level. So GVG, our company, we are a pioneer in regulatory technologies. We've been working with many regulators across the continent just to make sure that they can keep up with the digitalization of the economy, because as a regulator, you cannot be using paper-based regulation to monitor the compliance to your rules while the whole economy is completely digital. So we've been specialized in providing them the right tools so they can really monitor compliance to different regulations. Now we need to take it at a regional level so we can really make a difference. Thank you.
That's a big challenge for you coming up, actually. Well, you can give me a round of applause if you want to. So, Serene, you are the head of FinTech. You work in, mobile money is touted as one of the best of Africa's exports. So what does the digital gap also mean to you? And what policy have you seen that's been positive in able to advance this?
So thank you very much for the question. So for my area, in terms of fintech, digital gap is more, we can see it more between urban areas and rural areas. So you can see that in urban areas, we have a big capillarity of agent network where people can get access to be registered, to can access to transactions, and it's much easier. And but when it comes to rural, it's much more difficult, and two reasons are behind that. The first one is connectivity in those regions, in rural area, is very difficult sometimes. You don't have GSM coverage, and when you don't have GSM coverage, it's very difficult to actually do mobile money. And the second one is agent network. So because as there is no, usually it's difficult to find people around, you have one village and very few people, and when you have an agent there, for that agent to be profitable and make sustainable his business, it's very difficult. So it is why you can see that most of the time the penetration of mobile money in urban areas is very high compared to the penetration in rural areas. So, what we can do on those is to get sometime regulators to have funds to help us as MNOs to, first of all, to accelerate the coverage, and also we make a lot of efforts also to be a bit smarter in terms of how we pay the agents. So rural agent, we may give to them more than urban area, so that we can make the business profitable, because if the business is not profitable, they don't, they leave it and they do something else. So when it comes to policy, that can change also or accelerate mobile money. We can see also some, now the regulatory framework is changing a lot. So most of central bank has introduced what they call EMI, which is electronic money issuer, which help MNOs and third parties to be able to do mobile money by themselves without having a bank partner. Even if the float is still in a bank, but they are regulated by the central bank. So as MNO, we can talk directly to the central bank. We are also accountable and responsible vis-a-vis the central bank. And how it can help is that we've been able with that to launch some services that was very difficult to be launched when we used to partner with banks. For example, if we say lending, today you can see, for example, we know that women as a populace, they have more issues to get access to credit. So a woman selling tomato in a market can wake up, have a loan with MTN, $10, $15, and buy tomatoes, sell them, and at the end of the day, repay the loan. And we do more because we push her also to save so that she can have her own working capital at the end of the day. So those kind of services, we were able to push them because we were able to discuss with the regulator. And before, when we tried to do it, it was a bit of friction with the banks because they have their own offers, but which are not targeting those kind of people. So, and countries where we can see very good regulators who took very good initiatives on that. We can have Kenya, why M-Pesa is so successful, but Ghana, Rwanda are very pioneer on those things.
It's very interesting to hear how you've been able to get women to be more empowered through this process and the role that policy has played in opening up the market and advancing the mobile money service. So I come to you, Sim. I don't know if you have a digital gap in Estonia, but what I do know is that your e-policy services have been very successfully touted. So I want to ask you how you've been able to advance policy across various ministries, and if you had an inclusion problem, how you were able to address them.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just perhaps say a few words about Estonia for those who have not come across us yet or visited us yet. But we are indeed a Nordic, Northern European country. We've been working on digitization throughout our whole society and economy for the last 20 years. And we have reached a point where today we can say that exactly the lives we lead are very digitally based, right? As a citizen, as an entrepreneur, as a government official, so forth, right? We've been building this in great partnership with our private sector, by the way. Many of those good companies are actually here in Transform Africa event as well, so you can sort of see them just outside afterwards. But my point being, this has exactly been possible by a few things. I mean, I can't say that we've always been the best when it comes to policy making, but at least we've tried in many ways. And I think the sort of core for us has been that we have been very willing to experiment and try things out, even if we don't know the outcome yet. So, for example, when we started with the digital signatures or data sharing platform X-Road or online voting, which we are the only country still to do, I mean, we didn't know if it will really work, but we said, but hey, why don't we try? Let's see how to make it work. And we have tried to bring this approach also to regulation areas. If you talk about, let's say, even the telecom side here, let's say, willingness to try and test things and then fix things agile ways if they don't really work well has been a big part of it. You asked about coordination. I think this is an issue of, let's say, governance of policies and policy making, whether it's connectivity, whether it's building digital government and so forth, is something that literally all governments around the world are trying to find the best ways, and it's constant balancing act, what's the best model. In Estonia, we started from a very top-down view. So at least when it comes to digital government building, for example, building of services in different government areas, we first were very sort of led by Prime Minister's office, and sort of, that's where the first building blocks for services came from, and roadmaps. Then we dissolved it to be rather decentralized. And in our case, we still sort of somehow stick to that every ministry is a digital ministry in their domain. because they should know how to best use these tools that digital technology gives us in their particular field. So, for example, as government CIO office, yes, we do have ideas how to best make use of digital tech in healthcare, but again, the healthcare folks should know the best because they understand, what the business is really about. So what happened in this decentralization, though, was that the pace ended up being rather uneven, and just like you described, getting everybody on the same page was difficult. So now we have come to basically like a hybrid model of policy making and steering, where we still have quite a bit of freedom to design, architect, procure, build systems and services in all different ministries, but we have a much more top-down also approach, at least to setting the strategy and bringing others on board with this. That's exactly what the government CIO office in our case is tasked with. But we are also a line ministry among others, but the way it works is that so we have been given a clear whole of government mandate. We have access to also the Prime Minister, the head of our government level, who then sort of steers the strategy making, and whom do we report? Is everybody on the same page, or helps out them politically? So that's the leadership part. And the third thing, the third thing is that so we have been given some whips, if you wish. For example, of course, the classic part in governments is regulation, right? So we can, in some sense, for example, if you want to make sure that everybody builds up services in a secure way, then the whip has been that we can sort of issue a certain standard for that. The other whip has been money. So we have been funding the upbuilding of services in different ministries. If they want to do something new, they come to us, and so we can attach conditions to that. Basically play by the rules, then you get funded, for example. But the fourth and most fundamental thing is that down the line, a lot of it comes down to like soft measures and like informal things we do, networks we do. So even if we can threaten you to not give you money down the line, it works best if we have actually had a nice party and we've come to this, agreement and understanding with each other, right? So, and partially I'm joking, but a lot of it comes down to basically just, this, what they call mechanisms, right? To bring stakeholders together, to bring ministries together, to bring outside stakeholders together, just basically get on the same page and then decide to move forward with that in an experimental way. So, perhaps I give you a very long answer now, but I think there's many sort of angles from really hard policy measures that have to be in place, access to, and sort of, of course, the steering from leadership part, but at the same time, a lot of it still happens basically on the level of people, and bringing those people together, getting them to share, getting them to collaborate, and then things happen.
Thank you very much, Sim, and that's a very insightful contribution you just made, because one of the biggest hurdles is first being able to harmonize your policies even internally before even thinking about going across borders, and which we'll come to later. So it's good to hear. I would like to explore the soft measures even into more detail, but I think we'll go to Microsoft. We'll go to Sergit now, and I'd like to ask, you work Microsoft for Africa. You work with content developers, and I want to know whether there is a digital gap in there, and also what specific policy have you seen that has been really positive in being able to close the gap?
Maybe I can start with your last question, which is, what is the best policy for us in Africa? And I think maybe it should be a policy that focuses on execution. Let's start there. Execution. I think we have a lot of intention, and intention is good, but execution is always better. And so I think to that end, I would give a couple of examples. Just yesterday, we've arrived from Nairobi this morning. We've launched the first Africa Development Center in Africa by Microsoft. It's a huge investment covering both two sites, Kenya and Nigeria. It's a $100 million investment that looks at actually hiring engineers sitting in Africa, working on products with our core engineering team. So if you ask me sort of what are the policies that you need, it's really from a government side, from a private sector side, focusing on execution. And as you look at it in terms of what are the areas that we should focus on to really move Africa's digital growth, is simply three things, okay? First is innovation, which is how do you actually spur innovation on the continent? How do you allow for developers to have access to the right tools, know-how, right? And really allow them to create African unicorns. I know there's a lot of debates nowadays about Jumia, whether it's African or not, should they really be classified an African startup? it doesn't matter. Go create the next one, okay? That's where sort of the focus and the energy should be. Second, focus on skills. We don't have the skills in Africa today, so we need to invest and double down on skills building. And so it was great to hear the President Uhuru talking about sort of how skilling is part of the digital economy that Kenya has worked on. But we need to make it continent-wide, right? And we need to make sure that it's a multi-year investment across sectors that needs to land in. And third, you can't have innovation and you can't have skills without affordable access. And I think that's the point that my panelists have touched on, which is how do you actually create affordable access that brings in first and last mile together to create a shared economy that has inclusion at its heart and be able to move forward. So I'll sum it up to say a policy that's focused on execution.
That's a brilliant summary, actually. Policy that's focused on execution. And so we've heard about the various, you've talked about execution, you've talked about harmonization within country. So how do we get harmonized? How do we harmonize policies across borders? I mean, what has been your experience, GVG, being able to, what has been your influence in policy making and how you've been able to get policy to be done across borders? And if there are examples, please mention them.
Yeah, I'd like to mention one area where I believe that that requires serious policy harmonization. One thing that I've seen in many countries, they are, in order to create digital identity, which we've been talking a lot about, one key element is to acquire what they call a public key infrastructures. In many countries, they have invested millions, and each of those countries will have a PKI, will have a certificate authorities, so they can issue certificate and what is in digital identity, allowing people to sign digitally and access internet. So I think it's important now in this conversation to start having them at a regional level, because there's no point of Rwanda issuing a digital identity. When you go to Senegal, it cannot work. So the different certificate authorities, they need to start putting in place policies where they can trust each other so your ID can be valid all over Africa. So I think this is one area that requires that we started discussing about how do we, one of the core elements that can enable digital identity, we can have a common policy across the continent. Based on our experience, we've been working very actively with Smart Africa Alliance in order to harmonize the different regulations in countries to lower tariff between countries in terms of calls and roaming. So it's been there are many hubs like in East Africa, in West Africa, where you travel between countries and roaming is free. And for that to be possible, all the regulators had to meet and agree on how they can formalize all of that. So I think those are areas, that tangible examples where collaboration and harmonization has started, and where, which the previous one, which I mentioned, is another area where we should start discussing how we harmonize the different platforms for a real digital identity.
Digital identity is quite a controversial topic, but I do know that that the process has started. So in terms of the policy making, it's good to know that you started with the Smart Africa Alliance, but we can talk when we open up the discussion how we can make sure that it's really inclusive.
Yep.
So Serene, you know, when you talk policy making and the digital divide, what policy do you think would you suggest to policymakers to be able to close the digital gap beyond what you've seen in mobile money? What other new policies do you think needs to be done rapidly to be looked at, or regulatory reforms that need to be looked at in the ICT sector to close the digital gap?
So for fintech era, I think what is important is that the central banks, first of all, the most important is to understand who is regulating it. because more and more we have started seeing central bank who want to regulate, and also the telecom regulator who start wanting to regulate as well. So I think to have a standardization and harmonize that to make sure that there is one regulator regulating those entities who are driving mobile money is very important, first of all. Second one is for central banks to enable third parties or MNOs to be able to really play a role in fintech by providing a regulatory framework which allows them to have their own license and deal directly with them. It has several benefits. The first one is that it enables them to be able to be responsible, and also when it comes to anti-money laundering, to compliance, to make sure that they have tools they need to monitor all the transactions. The second one is also in terms of execution and go-to-market. It is very important that when you have some idea to innovate, to disrupt the market, you will be able to go and see your regulator directly without any intermediary and go and discuss with them, to present, to explain so that they understand and they can put together the needed regulatory framework to enable that innovation. I think that is very important. And from my experience, what we have been doing is that we started in several countries with different regulatory framework. But once we identified what is the best regulatory framework, what we are doing is that we are a bit lucky because we are operating in countries where we have central bank, regional central banks. So, for example, in West Africa, you have BCAO. In Central Africa, you have BEAC. So, for example, when BCAO launched a new regulatory framework, which shows what we were looking for, and BEAC was not launching it, what we did is that we organized a workshop with BEAC and discussed with them, and we brought people from BCAO, we brought Central Bank from Kenya, Central Bank from Ghana, and we brought in also GSMA and some expert, fintech expert around the world. And we have a 2 days discussion, and after the 2 days discussion, they got comfort that giving licenses to MNOs will only accelerate financial inclusion. And also they asked a question to their colleagues, how did you write the policy? Did you have any issues, face any issues with telcos operating? And they got a bit of comfort, and after that, after 3 months, they released a new regulatory framework. So I think there is a bit of education, but how you can educate people is to push them also to meet with people who are ahead of them, as their own colleagues, not us to go and tell to them that this is the right way to go. I think that was very important, and it was a big click on enabling regulators.
Yeah, it's very important you mentioned the role of the regional bodies and engaging them at that level as well. And the turf war between central banks and the ICT regulators on mobile money. But it's good to see that there's a harmonized approach that can be taken. So back to you, Sim. Africa has the gender gap has mainly affects women. And we also do have marginalized groups as well. But when you were talking about your policies, when you started, you've been able to even out and be able to create access across board. What lessons can Africa learn from Estonia in being able to bring true inclusion in all its ICT policies? Mm-hmm. And how did you do it?
Well, so in the context of inclusion, I'll leave it with you to decide if there are lessons that Africa can learn, but I can clearly sort of share what we see have been the biggest contributing factors, at least. And the first of all, it is this way that indeed, we have always seen issues around skills, connectivity, and so forth as necessary, unavoidable part of the package of whatever else we do when it comes to digital development, right? So basically, these are the conditions where I think we all agree that have to be there. We haven't done as a country, or we haven't had the need to do that much targeted interventions by groups necessarily, for example, by gender or by ethnicity or age or anything like that. Our approach has always been exactly, let's try to figure out how we can horizontally lift all the boats, right? Because we also started 20 or so years ago from the context where, of course, majority of people were offline, and we already had a government, banks and so forth starting to offer services online. So the attempt was, okay, how can we bring them now online in the first place? How can we reduce the biggest digital gap, which is between the offline and online people in the first place? Some of the things that have worked for us, perhaps just to highlight, in terms of connectivity, the biggest factor has been that we have tried to build a regulatory environment that is very easy, very streamlined, so basically that brings on healthy competition in the market. So that has really been the biggest part of affordability, because there's a heavy competition, which means that the prices of services are very contested between different sort of players and providers. And that comes basically for the fact that it's very easy to enter the market, to be in the market, to get spectrum. I mean, it all happens fast and streamlined. Secondly, when it comes to, again, connectivity, we did have to, and we still have to, approach the issue of geographic differences, I think a bit like you pointed out, between urban and rural. So for us, even though we are a small country, 1.3 million people, we still have quite a bit of difference between market failure in terms of rural and urban areas. So that is why even years ago we had a government and public sector jointly invest into shared computing facilities, hotspots at the libraries where people could, or community centers where people could go and have an easier way to get access online if they didn't have it available in their homes. What else has worked? Skilling clearly has been, and I think you brought it out, and it's been brought out several times, but I mean, skilling has the biggest sort of contributing factor. We pulled forces together with private sector. Actually, it was private sector led at the very beginning in terms of massive digital literacy campaigns and, literally dragging people to, use internet for the first time, right, and teach them through. Mind you, that was still at the time of PCs and where you had to work with the mouse keyboard. I mean, the whole spiel stuff, right? Way easier now. But the point being that I think exactly making this effort and really sort of what we found out, the biggest thing was not the issue of skills, but figuring out what's in it for the people. So you have to figure out what's in it for me. It might be access to mobile, let's say mobile banking or payments. It can be access to newspaper online, whatever else works. If they got a hook, they're willing to learn more. And last two things, we've been really always trying to see if we provide services online as a government, for example, how do we make it this way that the threshold of using them is as small as possible? So in that sense, I have to mention that things like good service design are very crucially important, because then the threshold of learning to use the service in the first place is not that high. That also helps to reduce the gaps of starting to come online in the first place. All the way to, that is why, for example, we introduced a rule in our legislation called once only, which really means that as a government, the next agency should not ask you again if some other part of government knows some data about you anyway. And this pushed the different interactions you have with the government to be much simpler, faster, smoother, because less aspects and elements was needed to complete some bureaucratic interaction with the government. And so things like these, basically, that push for much better designed services actually reduce this threshold too. So from connectivity to skills to exactly how the government itself provides like these services, all these things matter.
Wonderful to note. Amrote, we've heard about upskilling, you've talked about execution. How can we make how can we enforce digital literacy? What policies do we need to see? And what should the role of private sector be in trying to push these policies to ensure that there's true inclusion, especially bringing more women, making them more digital literate?
I think maybe I'll pick up. Look, I think there's some grave errors we're making in terms of thinking around how do we actually transform and learn from others. Estonia is a great example, but it's a very unique example. So we can't ask the question, how does Africa learn from Estonia? Perhaps we can ask, how does Rwanda learn from Estonia? Because the scalability and replicability of Estonia, Nigeria, or Ethiopia is almost impossible. So I think there are some fundamental things that we need to understand around where are we looking to learn, right? We should definitely take best practice, but what does it take for us to get to where they are, okay? The second piece is around, when we're talking about digital divide, it's everything and anything, right? So are you talking about the person who's completely disconnected in a rural area, or are you talking about the person who has a feature phone but not a smartphone because of affordability around access to the internet? Are you talking about sort of looking to bring people into the digital age, or are you looking at upskilling those into sort of a 21st century skills-based workplace? So I think there's a wide range of things that we need to unpack in even talking about digital divide, because frankly, it's neither here nor there in terms of implementation. So I think, there's a very good African saying, if you don't know where you're going, you can't get lost. So we need to figure out where it is that we're going as Africa, and then from there decide what are the policies that we need to have, which are the countries that have been successful in implementing it, and how do we learn best from them. And then third, who are the partners that will help us do this and do it right in a staged phase, right? So again, I come back to innovation. It really is at the core of sort of what we want to drive, especially if we want to compete globally. Skills and affordable access for us to be able to drive it.
Just coming back to what you mentioned, which partners should we have on the table, around the table, to be able to deliver the policies that we want to see? In your experience, which partners do you want to see in private sector, public sector? What kind of partners do you want to see?
Let me just jump in. I think from our side, in terms of private sector, a public sector engagement, one is that has an agenda and a focus, but also in terms of accountability, in terms of deliverables as well, right? So you can take any government, but when you look at sort of their ICT or their growth agenda, and you have different forms of it across different countries, whether it's Vision 2030, GDP plans, there are all sorts of plans that are in place looking at economic growth across Africa. But a meaningful partnership is one that is anchored around tangible, but also one that has a win-win on all ends. Because otherwise where you'll end up is in a, not that there's anything wrong with it, but in a donor-led environment, one that is not as attractive to private sector as it should be. So if we're clear from a government perspective around that, what is it that we want to achieve and what is in it for a private sector to come and play and win, I think then we have an opportunity to really attract but also develop the continent in a way that is long-lasting and sustainable.
Brilliant. Did you want to make an intervention?
So I think partnership between public and private is something fundamental for mobile money, because mobile money is about trust. You need people to trust because it's about money. And what we've noticed is that in some countries where government trust us to use mobile money for collection for some government services, it did accelerate the penetration of mobile money. I can give some example here in Rwanda, where tax collections and a lot of government services, it's mandatory to do them by mobile money. And that created a trust from population, because they're saying if the government trusts this system, we should trust it and it can work. And the other example is, for example, in Ivory Coast some years ago, where the government put mandatory the collection of school fees for all primary schools. And after that, we saw that it was a big acceleration of mobile money penetration as well. So I think governments today, they have, all of them, some targets in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of cashless society. But when they do some practical effort to expose us, it helps to achieve their own targets as well.
I mean, the practical example of Cote d'Ivoire also involved the role of civil society, who we tend to forget about, this third partner. This is very relevant in this. So it's not just governments and private sector, but civil society as well, very important. So we'll come to the audience. We have about the chance to ask about 3 questions. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand. We'll try and see in this blinding light. And please introduce yourself and your organization, and then just keep it concise. So the floor is open.
There's one there.
Yeah.
Right. Is there a microphone? Is there a roving mic? Otherwise?
Are they open?
Yeah.
And can I just have a show of hands, those who want to ask questions, so we could just manage the time, please?
Shem Muchwodo, Africa Diaspora in ICTs. My brief question, any of the partners on the panel, do you have a program to engage Africa's diaspora in ICT? I ask this because they are like the forgotten Africans. I've been listening from yesterday. I rarely come across that word, and yet they're driving Africa's economy. They contribute every year $80 billion into the continent. If I take my country, Kenya, $3 billion every year, more than the top 3 agricultural exports put together. Do any of your institutions have a program to engage Africa's diaspora? Thank you.
All right, so there's a question on how do we include Africa's diaspora in our programs. Any more questions on the floor? So maybe you can start with that. Who wants to take it?
I can
Sorry?
start.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest problems for the diaspora is today to send money back home to Africa. And sending money to Africa is the most expensive destination when it comes to send money. So as mobile money industry, we've taken some initiatives to really try to decrease that cost to sending money to Africa by enabling MTOs to be able to send money directly to wallets. Because what was costing a lot of money is the distribution that people were building. And also, as you know, we've created Mowali, which is a company we've created with Orange, and some others will join. And the idea is to federate our networks to create interoperability, but also to allow people who are sending money to our people in Africa to be able to have only one connection, and you'll be able to send money to all our customers. And by doing that, the cost of sending money to Africa can go down from 10% to 1%, because it's very easy. You reach people, and also the main issue is that today, I won't give any name, but when they send money to Africa, they just decide that the price would be high. And if we are together with the receiving part, and we tell to them that you need to not to go more than further than 2-3%, if they don't accept, any little MTO can become very big because you have access to a network. So by doing that, we help the diaspora at the same time to lower the cost of sending money back home.
I think if I may add, I think money is one very way of sort of engaging the diaspora, but that's not the only way. I think the biggest asset that African diasporas have, wherever they are, is actually in contributing in their knowledge and know-how. And I think over the last 6 years, with the Microsoft for Africa initiative, Microsoft has 120,000 employees. And one of the programs that we have laid out is for the African diaspora, but also open to all global citizens to come into Africa, to work with a startup, with our partners, with our customers, and to really spend anywhere between 1 week to 2 weeks at no cost to them, to come and actually impart their knowledge and know-how in terms of what they know. So I agree money is one thing, but really the biggest asset that we have in the diaspora is knowledge.
Any more questions or interventions?
Sorry, if I can only just briefly complement one thing. Obviously, I won't be speaking from African diaspora angle, but I think the two things there. But first of all, you're quite right in the sense that the biggest contribution can be in terms of knowledge and so forth, but I think it often comes down to that us as governments, we don't necessarily keep too much touch. Right? So I think in many ways, and obviously that's again where digital tech can be quite helpful, even through social media and otherwise, right? I mean, to consciously keep this relationship, maintain and build this relationship with our diasporas, right? That they want to be involved and so forth. We have the same thing with our sort of, expats sort of around the world as well, right? We're trying to see how to best sort of have this close link with them, even if they choose to live outside. But secondly, identity has been mentioned here. And I mean, it's often talked in the context, of course, of domestic audiences, but I think identity also, strong digital identity and including and giving diaspora also an option to have access to that is one part of the solution as well. Even for the simplest matter, I mean, that makes it easier to set up companies back home, right, or whatever else it might be like that.
So removing layers of bureaucracy as well for the diaspora. I saw a hand up there. If you can please introduce yourself, yes? Please.
Hello everybody. Mon nom c'est Moussa Saleh Adamou. Je me permets de parler en français. I will try to speak in French.
Oh, French.
My name is Moussa Saleh Adamou. I'm the General Director of ESMT, École Supérieure Multinationale basée à Dakar. Donc ma question elle est relative à l'aspect que vous avez évoqué tout à l'heure concernant la prise en charge de la régulation au niveau de la Banque centrale. En fait, initialement, nous nous sommes dit que c'était un problème de compétence. C'est pourquoi la Banque centrale a pris en charge toute la régulation du mobile banking. Il y a aussi, par exemple, la partie compliance, AML, CFT que vous avez évoqué. Est-ce que ça, c'est un état de fait?
Sorry, pardon, on n'arrive pas à vous entendre. Est-ce que vous pouvez prendre un autre micro ou vous approcher?
Ou bien je peux parler beaucoup plus fort peut-être?
Oui, peut-être.
Ok. Et donc, mon nom, c'est Moussa Saleh Adamou. Je suis le directeur général de l'École supérieure multinationale des télécommunications. Donc, ma question elle est relative à l'aspect que vous avez abordé par rapport à la compliance et à la régulation du mobile banking. Je disais initialement, nous pensions que la Banque centrale avait pris en charge la régulation du mobile banking parce qu'il y avait des problèmes de compétences au niveau des régulateurs traditionnels, les ARTP ou bien les ARCEP. Est-ce que dans la tendance, c'est-à-dire dans le court et le moyen terme, cette tendance va continuer ou bien est-ce qu'il y aura une équipe transverse qui réunira les régulateurs traditionnels, la Banque centrale, pour mettre en place les règles juridiques par rapport à la gestion du mobile banking?
Can you please repeat?
Can I answer? Okay, the question was that mobile money is being regulated by central bank today, while most of mobile banking operators come from telco background. So his question is, are we going to always have central bank regulating the mobile money operators, or we'll have now two regulators regulating them?
Okay.
Is there something you can say?
I can, but...
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I think when you look at the mobile money ecosystem, you have the infrastructure, and depending on the type of license that you can find in different countries, usually is the responsibility of the telco regulators to make sure that the infrastructure being used are mainly telco infrastructures, so it's has the proper quality in terms of quality of services adequate to provide the service. But at the same time, mobile money fall under financial transactions, and in terms of, for example, as my fellow panelists can support me on that, there are guidelines and regulation issued by central all the virtual money circulating should be equal to physical money, for example. Those are guidelines on which they have to report. So those are informations that are very important. And there are also certain informations that are related to AML. And so I think the one example that I have seen that worked very well is here in Rwanda, where the regulator and the central bank, they established some kind of MOU where they work together, and all the informations are sent to both agencies, and they work together to make sure that they can follow different aspects of the mobile money.
It's been a bit of a controversial issue. I remember when I was working in the industry as well. But Serene, I think you've moved beyond that, right? You're now having a more harmonized. So maybe I know you mentioned it, but you could just reiterate it.
Yes. On top of what he was saying is that now the new guidelines we get from central banks is pushing us, or it is mandatory to have a separate company. Which is the company which will be performing mobile money. So that separate company needs to have also a very clear relationship with the telco, so that if you use the telco distribution network, you need to have a contract. If you leverage on telco technical system, you you need to have a contract between them. And where we are moving is that there will be a complete separation between the telco and the mobile money. Even if at early stage we leverage on some assets from the telco, but I think the future is to have quite separate. I don't know if you watch or if you listen to the result from Safaricom 2 weeks ago, where they said that in 2 years' time, 50% of the revenues will be from fintech. So when that starts happening, you need to have them separated, and which will be, because now it's a fintech and you're competing against other fintechs.
Just one thing I'd like to, so based on what he just said, you are seeing different scenarios in different countries. So I think this is one area that might require harmonization in terms of policy. So this way we can really take full advantage of what is the best option in terms of regulation, and that can easily allow the mobile money to be some kind of, not one, in one country you see something and in the other one, so it's going to be difficult. So I think regulators, I think they need to start discussing so they can harmonize the different policies and setup they have.
So I've been alerted that we are running out of time, so we'll just go to the closing comments. Mamroti, I'm going to come to you. If you had to challenge, policymakers, what is the one thing that you tell them that they need? This is a low-hanging fruit. You need to resolve it in order to be able to bridge the digital divide. I know you talked about execution, but what else?
Actually, no, I'm going to come back to it. It's execution. We've been here many times, had many very good conversations. We're still lacking on execution.
So how can we execute? What is the implementation? What do you want to see? And how do we move?
Look, I think we've talked about identifying the problems. I don't think there's anyone in this room today that doesn't understand the challenges that Africa is facing. If you do have any questions, please raise your hands. But everyone knows what the challenges are. And we talk about what the solutions are, but implementation and execution is the biggest challenge that we have. So whether it's capacity, whether it's know-how, whether it's resources, we need to figure out, again, we have a great platform, Smart Africa is here, World Bank has its own project. We need to figure out how it is that we can actually move the needle in executing and making a difference. So my ask, my plea is let's start executing.
Execution. I know, you're not based in Africa, but if you had to advise a country in Africa on how to be able to move the needle, what would you say the implementation should be? What should execution look like?
Actually, in many ways, the message will be pretty much the same. in a sense that, I was hinting with a different set of words, but what sort of contributed most to Estonian sort of journey and still does is basically just do it, sort of attitude, right? Even if you don't have the perfect answer, even if you don't have the perfect solution, just start going at it, just get the action going, start experimenting if you wish, right? And I think that's one point. Obviously, it doesn't just make sense to run in all different directions. I mean, there has to be some sort of plan. What we have seen, not just based on Estonia, but around the world, working with different countries, that there are some building blocks that better be in place for digital economy and government to work out, like identity, like for data sharing, like core registries, like rule of law and data protection and so forth. So, but even then, you can still start working on them and some concrete applications that make people's lives better already today and just get going.
Serene, how can we go beyond the talk? I mean, Amroti said, look, we've talked. I mean, we need action. So, and she's mentioned resources as well. How can governments maybe they'll say they need money to be able to execute? What do you need to do, Serene?
You want to?
No, Serene, you first,
Okay.
and then us.
So for me, I think in fintech space we are still in an early stage where we need some standardization of policies. So we have some countries where we are very advanced in terms of regulation, and those countries, they understand, those regulators, they understand very well the service. And we have some other countries where it's the opposite. So I think there is a need of collaboration for those who are really not ahead to try to understand. And I think in the next coming years that would be very important for regulators who are behind to try to catch up, and that would be done through collaboration using the regional or African bodies for that to happen.
So would the private sector support this collaboration?
Yes, sure. What we are doing is that MNOs we are with GSMA, which is the association. So what we are doing is that we are using GSMA to do a lot of advocacy. So and they organize a lot of discussion between central banks and try also to upsell them for them to get there.
So, bye-bye.
When it comes to execution, I think we need first to look at what is the vision. I think the vision is clear, and we need to move forward. Africa needs to decide and the way it sees the future. Digital economy is already here. It's not a parallel economy. It's an extension of the traditional economy, which is migrating more toward digital. So I think that we need to, the vision is clear. And this morning we have seen the president of Kenya with the blueprint for like a fully digital economy.
We need to see how the execution will.
Now we need to move forward and execute. And one thing I would like also to highlight, and it is really related to what our company we've been doing, is just to make sure also the regulators can keep up with all of this digitization by having the right ICT tools, by having the information near real time, so this way they can monitor compliance, and now also they can collaborate also. Cross-border collaboration between different regulators will be key, just to make sure that we follow the same visions to the benefits of our continents, because ultimately digital divide, and as I said earlier, should be looked at from a perspective of improving socioeconomic development, and at the same time foster social inclusion to improve life in our communities, to make sure that government can provide better services. So those are the way we should be looking at. We see the problems, but how ICT can be used to solve those problems. I think that's always should be the approach, because most of the time we tend to get lost into buzzword and we forget the problem we are trying to solve. So people talking about big data, but if it's not about a huge volume of data. It's about data where you can crunch and then get inside information in order to implement informed, better policies. So those are the way I think we need to be more practical, and that goes back to the point of execution. So how can we move forward and execute based on this clear vision that we all already know what it is?
And also to ensure that we have real measurements, checking and coming back to assess how well we are doing. So thank you very much. A big round of applause to my panel who've done justice to this topic within a short time. And let's remember execution. We need to go forward. The digital divide has agenda, and it also has it's a big barrier that we need to overcome if we really want to ensure transformation. Collaboration is very important between public sector, private sector, and civil society, and we need to be holding ourselves accountable. Next year, when we come and have this conversation, I don't think we want to be repeating that we are having execution problems. So thank you very much once again to the audience as well. A big round of applause for yourselves for sitting through right after lunch. I know it's been a challenge. So thank you.
mwese mukomeje gukurikira rero televiziyo y'u Rwanda. Iyi session rero akaba ariyo ya kabiri ibereye ariko hano imbere mu auditorium ariko